Welcome to another episode of Better Gaming, an event and podcast series dedicated to all aspects of ethical gambling as we seek to discuss how to make it safe, secure and socially balanced for everyone. My name's Jim, I'm the host of this show, and in this episode I'm talking to Maurice Catania, who is a chartered psychologist and a veteran in the gambling industry with over 14 years of experience in game integrity and safer gambling. Thank you for joining me today, Maurice.
No problem. Thank you for the invite.
Now, listen, it's a pleasure having you on. Before we go into the bones of the podcast and go into your background, of course, I just wanted to set the scene for today's podcast. I wanted to share why today's topic matters so much to me. In the UK, the NHS has seen an increase of 55% of gaming addiction for young people between 2021 and 2023. And we're also seeing an increase in gambling features cleverly disguised and sneaking into games that children absolutely love, like my son who plays 25 and Roblox, and the impact that that is having on them is quite alarming. There is a recent stat that has said 71% of popular mobile games being played by children in the UK last year had loot boxes in them. And for those that don't know what loot boxes are, they have a very similar mechanism to gambling. And so how does that translate on the impact of the young generation in the UK? Well, last year, the NHS announced that 85,000 children had been identified as being problem gamblers in the UK, and that has doubled in the last year. So not a small increase, quite a significant one. And whilst everyone's worried about screen time, these games are quietly normalising gambling behaviour, in my opinion. Children are spending £50 on average on in-game items and loot boxes, and my son's no different, and it's something that I'm facilitating as an adult. And I am really, really interested in hearing about how I can safeguard my child and give him the best protection against any of these gambling mechanisms within the games that he's playing. So that is the essence of the podcast today. Before we get into all of that, Maurice, I'd love you to tell our listeners how you got into gambling, your background and your journey to this point today.
No problem. So I stumbled onto gambling, to be honest. I was a psychology student. I did my degree and I was doing my master's. And I think it was like 2009. It was not that easy to find a job in psychology. So I was doing a lot of odd jobs. I used to teach acting to kids. I used to be a theater receptionist. So everything that I could do. And it's a weird story because there are these garages in Malta where like some of the cute would meet up and play music, and my friends were playing music, and I was there with some other girls, and I was telling them, "Oh, let me teach you how to play poker," because that's what you do. And a friend of mine who was working with Unibet at the moment said, "Why don't you join the company? You know, we need someone to work in the fraud department." So I thought, why not? So I applied, and at the time it was just starting the industry in Malta, so we didn't really need to have that much extensive experience. And I joined thinking that once I do my master's and I finish, I'll just leave. And instead, I'm a numbers person, so I love maths and I love all this data analytics. So I started seeing there was so much information going on to detect fraud. So can we try to detect gambling harm? So I got the position of RG manager in 2011, responsible gambling manager, and I started pushing boundaries at the time. And I was extremely lucky because I had managers who really supported me in this. So when markers of harm was still maybe very lightly touched upon, I was one of them who would go up to my manager and tell him, I want to look into this, like why are people becoming so abusive, or I can see some people chasing losses. Can we do something about it? And yeah, I got so immersed in the field and that I decided to do a PhD on responsible gambling. And again, I was extremely lucky to have Professor Mark Griffiths as my director of studies because he's the godfather of gambling studies and behavioral addiction. So yeah, the rest is history then. Then I stayed with Kindred for 13 years and I'm now a freelance consultant with a lot of different companies.
Excellent. So you did your doctorate whilst you were working in the gambling industry. So that
Yes.
kind of makes quite a lot of sense in terms of specializing within that field.
It was so interesting because I was very lucky that I had no issues to accessing data. If I wanted, like part of the PhD was looking into self-exclusion, if it's a good proxy measure for problem gambling. And I could get access to data through Kindred. So I was really lucky that they never really told me like you can't look at this or you can't do this. Through Kindred, I had done a lot of research papers as well with other academics. So I think I have to commend them with that perspective. They really trusted what I was doing for quite some time.
Firstly, it's great to hear that Kindred were so supportive of the responsible gambling element and your support of your studies. What were the main tenets of your PhD in terms of young people, gambling harm? Were you specialising in a particular tenet of it?
It was mostly around consumer protection. Like I looked into how consumer protection is present and different gambling operators. I looked into like self-exclusion, if it's a good proxy measure for problem gambling. And then I focused a lot on markers of harm. So what is the best approach to try more around the proactive side of responsible gambling? Because I know maybe it deviates a bit from our discussion today, but there's still some tension between responsible gambling and commercial interests. I think it's when people tend to have a look at RG more as a reactive thing. So if you look into RG as offering limits, offering self-exclusions, then yes, I would have to agree that it can impact commercial. But if you do a very more proactive approach, if you look into how can I prevent the harm from happening, it will just go hand in hand with commercial interests. And that is something that people should realize a bit more by now because it's been so many years that we've been doing it. If you are very proactive in detecting people who might have harmful gambling, you are not only preventing harm to that gambler, but you're preventing harm to the company. You're preventing potential fines. You're getting as well customers who are more sustainable. Because you can get like quick win customers where they spend a lot of money quickly, or you can get customers who, set a limit and continue working slowly and continue playing, not relentlessly, but just a bit every month, which is the excellent business model because you need something which has longevity rather than quick win.
And just when you were talking about it there, I was really interested. It's
Yes,
moving
okay.
towards what we had initially discussed. But just in terms of when you're looking at profiles of players, are you seeing any upticks or trends in the younger profiles, just in terms of the accessibility of gambling products in mobile phones?
I think with accessibility, we have to realize that everything is online now. So, like, I teach at the University of Malta, the module of cyber psychology, and you start seeing that everything that the younger generation is doing is online. So, previously, like a few years ago, we would look into people using their cards or their phone to pay as high risk because they have a suspension of reality when it comes to money. But when I was saying this to the students, they were saying like, no, that's not the case with us. Like if I have a 10 euro bill, I will spend it all. But with my phone, I can actually budget better. So sometimes I do feel like even me at 38, I'm too old to understand what an 18-year-old is going through because the generation gap is so large. Like if I had to compare maybe my online knowledge to my father, who's over 70 years old, but we can discuss similar things. We do have some similar notions, but people who are 18, 19, they were cyber babies, to a certain extent. They were exposed to online from the start. It's not about me having a choice of should I go buy my clothes online or in a shop. For them, it's of course online because that's what they're used to. Their lives are all online, so it's quite different to what we were expecting.
This is something that I've been drawing parallels between me and my son. So, whereas I am concerned about loot boxing in games and these gambling mechanisms, in some ways, I just see it as a digital version, but I do see it as a worry because when I was growing up, I used to badger my parents about getting football cards. But the only difference between me and my son is one, they're slightly more expensive than the 20 pence that I used to have to pay for the football cards. And the second element is the immediacy. My son will constantly badge me because it's within the household, whereas I think my parents had quite a strict approach, and they were there going, well, you can only get it with your pocket money, and that will come at the weekend. And then when the weekend comes, you then have to cycle down to the shop, go to the shop, pick it up, bring it back. Whereas there's this almost 24/7 always on element where kids can buy or have potential access to all of these mechanisms at any time.
We see it with TV as well. I mean, TV is a very good example where if like I would come from home from school and I switch on to TV and it's what's on TV. Nowadays, kids, like I have two boys, a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, and the 7-year-old will come and tell me exactly which episodes he wants to watch. Or if there's like a bit of a delay in the internet, oh my God, it's a tantrum. Whereas like I would joke around, like, listen, I used to time my pee breaks depending on the adverts. Like you don't have any, you don't have any like jurisdiction over here because you have to wait a bit. The same with adverts. Like they're not even used to watching adverts on TV because it's either Netflix or YouTube Premium. So for them, even the concept of waiting for the next episode or like we choose what they watch, for them it's out of this world because this is what we want and this is what we will watch.
So just moving on to the element of gambling mechanisms in video games, do you have any insight that you could provide in terms of what the psychological effects, if any, could have an impact on, like kids between 8 and 17?
I think my biggest worry at the moment, and there still needs to be more research done on it, to be honest, but I know a lot of regulators say like we need to focus more on the group of 18 to 24. And usually the reason is more like because the prefrontal cortex is still developing, a vulnerable population. But it's good to understand that we're seeing a whole new generation that we weren't like that as well. So last time I was like a few months ago, my son wanted to download Roblox. And I said, okay, before I can download it for you, I want to see what's going on. I want to see how it is. So I downloaded it. I used his date of birth. So he was 6 at the time. And when I was playing around, I mean, there's a level of desensitization that we see. So there were like Peppa Pig characters with blood and like gorish features, which I thought, why would someone put it on a children's platform? And I sometimes encounter these on YouTube as well, so that worries me. But then to another extent, when I was going in the lobby, there were like these little virtual rooms where you can play gambling products. But because there was no money involved, so it's all fake money, I think it was okay for them, like for the maybe who made these type of games there. But for me, it would worry me because obviously there's no RNG involved. There's no monitoring of the product, how it is. So if my son, who's quite young, goes on this product and he plays roulette and he can see that he's winning all the time, there's a level of cognitive distortion there that can happen that when he is older and even if he goes then to a gambling company when he's of legal age, there's a high chance that he will think that it will work in the same way. He will have this, not just the suspension of reality there, but also the concept of it's easy money. Whereas we need to teach, that this is not how it represents gambling. We need to teach these things. So I think that is one of my biggest fears is that gambling is so immersed in some games that it will give the illusion that then when they're of legal age, they will gamble thinking it's the same mechanism as they see in the gaming sphere.
I'm just citing back to my earlier example as well. One of the things that I'm really struggling with as a parent is demonstrating the value of money and the worth of money. When I was growing up, obviously it was notes and pound coins, and I'd throw it into my piggy bank, and I could see that money growing as I saved it, and I could see it disappear as I spent it as well. Nowadays, it's all digits on a screen, and as much as I'm trying to teach financial literacy with the plethora of financial services that have got child accounts, so he can access it, it's still digital numbers on a screen that don't really translate into the physicality of whatever they've bought.
Yeah, and it's not easy to be fair because obviously, like when you have the physical money in your hand, you can maybe quantify it a bit more. But then when it's numbers on a screen, you can't really understand. I mean, I see it with my kids sometimes. They would tell me, "Oh, can we buy something?" And I would like, "No, we reached our budget today." But you still have your phone. You can still use your phone to pay. It's not like we ran out of money, which is different than if I had like €5 note and I said, "Okay, this is €5 and this is what we we have today to spend. I don't think there's really like the best answer, to be honest. I'm still figuring it out as well as a mother. But
You must have all the answers.
no, because every time I find an answer, one of them will ruin it for me. So but what I try to do is usually I try to like have budgets for them. So if we go in a shop, I say, okay, you can only spend up to 10 euro. We need to understand that that's the figure that we have today budgeted for the day. Like even because it happened to us, like at one point there was a game on PlayStation and my son just wanted it and just expected us to pay for it. So we're trying to use like even on Revolut, for example, trying to have like little awards when you do something good. And then we explain, okay, so you have 10 euro, but the game is 60, so there needs to be 50 more before we can purchase it. My techniques do not guarantee no tantrums though, because that's always a guarantee to have a tantrum. But
I was hoping to get the answer for
no,
that to resolve
no,
that particular issue.
no. I usually just earphones then. Just let it go.
Do you think it's culturally accepted for gambling mechanisms to be available in video games for kids now? Or do you think it's just something that is not really considered, or?
I don't think we even realize sometimes how gambling is integrated in games. Someone like me will obviously see, like my son was playing this alphabet game and the sort of like roulette came up for him to get like more letters. And I'm saying it's an alphabet game, so 3 years, 4 years old, someone would play something like this. And when the wheel came up, I obviously get like a lot of red flags in my head, but someone else would just see it as a wheel. And I think that can be quite a bit of a problem. With gambling, I do see there's a lot of normalization already happening. So let alone with having them integrated in the gaming product. But then I'm also seeing in gambling, we're trying to integrate gaming products. So we're going through a gamification of gambling and a gamification of gaming. But I saw like there was a documentary on YouTube where they were looking into 12-year-olds who were playing on Counter-Strike and how they were losing so much money because with games, like you need to pass the next level. You want to succeed. You want to go ahead in order for you to continue the game. And most of the time, these gambling features are there to improve. And what I'm afraid of is that there's sometimes no control. And I mean, in the Maltese context, I don't see it as any alarms when we discuss about cyber effect or cybercrime. Rarely do I hear anyone talking about gambling and gaming. It's more like around potential grooming or bullying or sharing sexual images. So even the concept of, people might be gaming and there will be gambling features is still not really up for discussion. Whereas I think in the UK it's a bit better. You to see, I mean, even the fact that loot boxes are banned as far as I know in the UK, that's quite a good stance compared to other places where we have not really looked into it that much. We need to look more into this type of impact.
And do you think there are certain types of children that are more vulnerable to the effects of these mechanisms within games?
I think similarly to what we see in gambling. So we do see like younger males with low socioeconomic status can have an impact, but I think it's also because of the relationship with money. It's different. There's that quick rich attitude, like I need the money to get rich or I need to get more in order to, it's more of a necessity. Like I do see my kids, they don't really feel any financial pressures where there are other kids who might. There's a lot of discussions about neurodivergence. So you might have someone who has ADHD, so there's more issues with impulse control or more quick decisions or more abrupt decisions. So that can have an issue, of course.
Does that lead into, with like the ADHD, does that lead into obsessiveness, or is that a trait, not?
I think it could be a trait. Of course, I'm not a child psychologist, so I more focus on online behaviors, but there can be, especially with the impulse, is what worries me with neurodivergence and ADHD, is that you can have a lack of impulse control, especially when you're young. So everyone, when we're young, we have like we have lack of impulse control. But when there's ADHD, it might be a bit more prevalent. So you need to be a bit more careful in that case to make sure that there's some level of, like boundaries done and trying to understand and show that you need to plan ahead almost. That's why I mentioned the budgeting. When it comes to obsessive traits, I mean, like my son is autistic, so I do see him when he plays a game on his PlayStation, like he needs to pass it. And there's a level of like he needs to do it because otherwise he'll keep on thinking about it. But at the same time, I have other friends who are gamers. They find it so beautiful when they see it from him because they say, oh, that's what we used to do when we were kids as well. So I think it's all about balance, though. It's all about having that honest conversation. Like I would tell my son, listen, you're going to have 1 hour where you're going to play PlayStation, then we're going to stop. But I would never just go and say, okay, that's it, an hour is done, because I know it will frustrate him. But instead, I will go incrementally say, listen, 10 minutes left. We have to stop soon, 5 minutes left. So I think it's all about how to have that honest conversation with the kids. And as well, it's also trying to understand what they're doing as much as possible. Because one of the biggest risks that I sometimes see when I speak maybe to other parents is that sometimes they don't know what their children are doing online. So they don't know what they're playing. I remember a parent I had met, she was really frustrated because she realized that her son was playing some really violent games. And I said, oh, but where does he play then? He's like in his room on a PC with his headphones on. Whereas when my kid plays PlayStation, it's in the living room where I can see what he's doing. I don't allow headphones because I want to hear what he's having as well. So I think it's more about awareness. And sometimes these digital games, we're using them more as a form of babysitting because they are godsend in that perspective. You need some time if you need to work. They're very helpful. But at the same time, you need to be careful exactly as well what they're doing.
My son plays in a separate room. He's got a little playroom to himself, which is probably a bad combination. We do keep an ear out for any conversations when he's talking to people. And I myself try and understand the games. But even, for example, on Fortnite, even though I understand the basis of the game in terms of the structure of it, there are pockets like party channels and there's little pockets that kids can find themselves in. And my son is particularly good at this stage of letting me know if there's a stranger in that room or somebody's made a friend request, and we've laid down pretty solid laws for him in terms of you will not accept any friends that you do not know, and anybody that does do a friend request, you've got to ask either me or your mum. So we do it like that, but I guess we're not completely over it in that sense.
I think with online, especially the teenage years, I'm really afraid of those years to come. It's so well hidden. So that's why I think conversations are really important, the non-judgmental aspect. Because I remember when I was a teenager and if I had questions about anything, I knew I could ask my dad and I never got any judgment, which was really nice. So it was really easy for me to try, okay, so why, like, should I do this? A silly thing, for example, I remember once I was going on a date with someone, and they were going to drive, and I was still 16, and I told my dad, like, I don't know, because usually we just hang out like in the village where we lived, and he said, I'd rather you don't get in a car with someone because then he has authority, like he is in charge. So better you meet at a place. And as a 16-year-old, it didn't come to my head. But the fact, instead of telling me, no, you're not going out, it was more of a conversation like, listen, I am showing you the risks that I know through my experience. And I think it's the same way of, like, if my son has, at any point, for example, I see that he's getting a bit too obsessive with a level, I do tell him, let's stop, let's have a break for a bit because you're going to start thinking too much about it. Instead of just saying, no, that's it. You're terminating it.
I think it's being in tune and noticing any differences. I mean, one of the
Yes.
questions I was going to ask you was, how are there any signs in terms of markers of change to be worried about if a child is getting, either a gambling or a gaming addiction? And I guess it's just looking at their overall behavior and any changes with regard to that would indicate that there could be an underlying problem, and being just very in tune with that rather than, and not necessarily on that, listen, I told you 5 minutes ago, and then them having a tantrum because they didn't get their way, but just generally overall. Would that be correct?
Yes, I work a lot with different psychologists and psychiatrists, and they always point that out. Like as soon as you see a behavioral change, in a child or a teenager, it's very important to try and see what's going on. I find this really, I had read it once that children, because they're still quite young, sometimes they will change their behavior to fit in. Not like adults, we just usually just, this is who I am and this is how I'm going to be. But it's still a very sensitive period that they want to fit in. And I think that is such a problematic area, because when I was younger, like if I was bullied at school, like when I leave school, I leave school. Now, if I'm bullied at school, I might go home, which is meant to be a safe haven, and the bullying continues. So I think that aspect of sometimes just going offline is so important. I saw a meme last time, like we used to say BRB. Like people don't say it anymore because we're always online, and it gives you that perspective of like, okay, God, this is a bit scary now. But I do see it like it's so difficult for them. I mean, even in Malta here, they do get, like, eventually in school, they get a tablet to continue, to study on this tablet. And I'm almost concerned about it. Like, should they get that, or should we stick to physical books? They already have so much. But there are benefits to what we're seeing as well. I mean, I see it as well with, as I mentioned with Logan, like, we used gaming to help him communicate. So obviously with autism, there is always some type of issue with communication. So there needs to be a bit more understanding there. So what we did was we found games where there are two players involved. And we got his younger brother, and we told Logan, like, in order for you to play, you have to teach Arthur how to play. And that was so motivating for him that he was getting so much better in expressing himself. So I think there are still benefits, and there's still like a lot with coordination that can help. But it's all about having like a very good conversation, and at the same time trying to have a sort of boundary. Not that as soon as you wake up till the end of the day, constantly play and there's nothing. I mean, I've read about cases where someone, I think it was in Asia, where someone played so much that they died of exhaustion. So we see that drastic point of view. I read some gamers will put a catheter so they don't go to the bathroom so they can continue gaming.
Mm.
So I think it's all about balance. And a lot of these traits, I would see them with online gambling addiction, like the constant long hours, the spending more money, needing more, like you develop tolerance, you try to cut down and you don't manage.
Yeah, in the UK, we're starting to get longer days finally. It's been quite a cold, dark winter. And I have noticed that my son is preferring now to play out in the garden and play football, where previously he hasn't, because it's been cold, wet, and quite frankly, miserable. I'm always encouraged that I think his first option would always be outdoor exercise where possible. Maybe we need to move to Malta to allay some of my fears.
You won't have an issue with. Last time we had 2 days of rain in a row, and my youngest was complaining. I'm like, seriously, I have nothing to complain about.
Yeah,
Like 2 days is nothing.
he needs to experience some UK weather.
Yes, I'll just get him there for a bit.
Just there's two final questions or observations really that I'd like to ask you. And the first is where you were talking about how your child was learning different elements through gaming. Is there an argument that could be had with regard to children learning about responsible gambling early in a low risk, low stakes environment, whereby I was talking earlier about financial literacy, that I just let him cut loose on it, and when the money's gone, the money's gone, and then he'll get an understanding that if you bet hard, you lose hard as well.
Yeah. I know that there are a lot of like epic risk management. I know that there's like in the Netherlands as well, like FITA, who they do a lot of education in schools. So they do go and explain, but not in a way of a game. I've never seen that. I don't know if I've never seen it, to be totally honest. I have seen, for example, with autism, where they were using games as a way of helping them through social situations. So there was this initiative, like it's very stressful for them to go to the hairdresser. So there's a psychologist who turned this into a game, and they show them like step by step what's going to happen. So it helps them to control the anxiety. I think games are so good to teach, especially kids. So I think there is potential. I wouldn't start at an extremely young age, to be honest. I think more 12, 13, because it might normalize it a bit too much, in my opinion. But yeah, but trying to understand more around the risks and trying to understand more, gambling is a very high risk behavior, so you need to be sure that there is a level of responsibility involved.
The other thing that I wanted to mention was I was really interested in your phrase about gambling becoming gaming and gaming becoming gambling. And I will unashamedly admit I will probably be using that moving forward. So where possible, I will credit you. But do you think that is probably potentially one of the biggest problems, that it's falling between two camps? And for example, in the UK, we've got the Gambling Commission, they've got an uphill battle just in terms of regulating the gambling space as it is. And they're struggling to do it, as anybody would or could imagine, with the digital landscape that is changing so fast, whether that's social media, mobile sports books, all of that element of it. Do you think there is a case that this particular subject about gambling within games could be exacerbated by the fact that neither of the regulatory bodies on the video gaming side or the gambling side has capacity to address it?
I think when it comes to regulators, I still think the UKGC is one of the top when it comes to safer gambling. Honestly, even when I was head of RG, I remember you could have a conversation, you could ask, you could try to do some stuff, which was really inviting. Even nowadays, like if I have questions, or if I have research, I know that they actually do read and do have a look at it, which is very good to see. But the problem is that a lot of the times the main experts on the product are on the product side. So obviously the regulators will have always that challenge, because while they're still exploring what the product is, you have experts on the product side who are already 3 steps ahead. So while you have maybe like looking into markers of harm from one side, it could be that the industry is already looking into making this gambling product more gamified. So the markers of harm might not even be that much applicable as they used to be before. And when it comes to gaming regulation, I think there needs to be so much more. And then the problem will be, as we see with gambling, is to have a balance of keeping the product attractive, whereas at the other hand, trying to make it as safe as possible. So, I mean, you do hear sometimes, like some regulators would say, I would make the slots slower. But will that have an issue on the product at the end of the day? Will it just drive people to play on the black market then? Or will they still stay with the licensed operators? One of the things that I do see, for example, with the black market is that they make it so attractive and they make it so good that even the consumer doesn't realize that it's not a licensed operator. So if we start seeing that with games, it could be very typical that we might have regulations that are really protecting the players, and you still have the games that they don't care, and they might be more attractive to the player.
Okay, right. Final 2 questions for this episode. The first is a recommendation request. So you came recommended via my podcast interview with Martin Heijer from the European Association. Who would you suggest as a good future podcast guest for this show?
It's not an easy question. I think because we're talking about product risk and about product specifications, I would say Jonathan Park, because can I do 2? Because I have 2 in mind.
You can do 2.
Can I? Okay.
Yeah.
So there's Jonathan Park, more on the product risk perspective. So he's done a lot of research and he's really good at this thing. And then you have Mark Griffiths, as I mentioned, like I usually call him the godfather of gambling studies. But he has started the concept of cyber psychology and gaming much before most of the researchers. So yes, I would tell you 2.
Okay, brilliant. I'll try and dig around and see whether I can get him on the show. And then finally, obviously with your wealth of experience in safer gambling, what would you like to see happen in the next 18 to 24 months that would make the industry safe, secure and socially balanced for everyone? You can have 2.
That is not even, it's not going to help. No, there are so many things I would like to see. I would like to see more collaboration from operators with researchers. They don't understand how beautiful the data that they have is. because it's all objective and it's all the actual gambling behavior. So I would really love to see more collaboration, that perspective, more sharing of data, more collaborations with researchers as well and regulators, which is quite existent to be fair. And also more innovation when it comes to RG, where I feel sometimes that it's stuck in a very negative note. Like even when it comes, if you had to compare companies and you had to see their commercial communication compared to the RG messages, it's always very dark and dull when it comes to the RG messages. And I think if they had to use the same concept that they use to attract players to attract them to RG, it would make such a big difference.
That feels like a brilliant point to stop this episode. And it's a very encouraging way that I think the future is quite bright for responsible gambling within the industry. And I think there are pockets of innovation that are happening, and certainly talking to people like yourself puts faith that responsible gambling and safer gambling will move towards the center of the industry more so. So thanks a million for your time. I've really appreciated speaking to you, and I hope everybody's found this episode interesting. If anybody wants to contact you, what's the best place to find you?
Right, you can find me on LinkedIn, so I'll try to reply as quickly as possible.
Okay, brilliant. Well, what I'll do is I'll put all of your contact details in the show notes below wherever you're viewing this. And once again, thank you very much for your time. It's much appreciated. And for everyone else, I'll see you in the next episode.